all of a sudden, the New Orleans Saints are one of the biggest benefactors of one of the most dramatic head coach searches in recent NFL memory. We got all that and a little bit of land yap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net, and our Saints analyst over with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, I'm going to fill you in on the timeline as the New Orleans Saints could potentially announce their head coach as soon as this coming week. We'll take a look at the Las Vegas Raiders, who have settled on their head coach, and what the Dallas Cowboys search looks like and how it leaves the door wide open for the New Orleans Saints to land basically whoever they want. And they got a lot of help from the biggest Uno reverse in the NFL's recent history of coaching searches, with Liam Coen landing with the Jacksonville Jaguars. How it impacts the New Orleans Saints is massive. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, whether it's your first time or your next time. And of course, this show is part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms and conditions apply. The New Orleans Saints are one of the biggest benefactors of Liam Coen landing back with the Jacksonville Jaguars in what was one of the most dramatic head coaching searches in recent NFL history, probably since the McDaniels, Patriot, like all that kind of stuff that happened with Josh McDaniels. The difference here, though, is the phone calls, the missed calls, the drama, the soap opera of it all. We'll get into all the details of that here in just a moment, but I want to focus first on the brass tacks, right? The brass tacks is that Liam Coen, former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is now the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. That has some major impact for the New Orleans Saints head coaching search. Had the Jacksonville Jaguars, who had Liam Coen on the board as probably their top guy, they were ready to hire him, all that other stuff, he ends up pivoting, going back to Tampa. When that was the case, that could have opened up Jacksonville, who was interested in Coen as a young offensive mind, that could have led to Jacksonville looking to other young offensive-minded head coaching prospects, which could have cut into guys that could be at the top of the list for the New Orleans Saints. Joe Brady over with the Buffalo Bills, Kellen Moore with the Philadelphia Eagles, and then, of course, Kliff Kingsbury with the Washington Commanders. If there still ends up being interest in Kingsbury, at least for the Saints. But had the Jacksonville Jaguars not landed Coen, they could have easily pivoted to one of those other guys. They still had interviews with Patrick Graham, the former Raiders and former Giants defensive coordinator. They were still looking at Robert Saleh, the former New York Jets head coach, and all those other pieces. But they could have said, you know what, really like the Liam Coen mold for a young quarterback in Trevor Lawrence. Let's go find another young offensive guy that can innovate and maybe get something done with him. And Trevor Lawrence and his skill set and his play style, not too terribly dissimilar, not the same, but not too terribly dissimilar from Josh Allen. So with the right guidance, maybe Trevor Lawrence would have been a guy that could have made sense pairing up with a Joe Brady. But the Jacksonville Jaguars landed Liam Coen after this entire, what I'm calling the Liam Coen chicanery. And that's great news for New Orleans. The other reason why it's great news for New Orleans is that Liam Coen's no longer in the NFC South. But so here's the deal. Here's what happened with Liam Coen, right? Liam Coen finishes the season riding high off of a playoff appearance for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Did a good job with that offense and Baker Mayfield and all that. Ends up taking couple of interviews with the Jacksonville Jaguars, virtual, in person, all that kind of stuff. The Jaguars go down the road on trying to hire him. He does not take that job. He ends up going back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and agreeing on an extension that would have made him the NFL's highest paid coordinator in the league's history, but doesn't sign the contract. Instead of signing the contract, he says, I'll be right back. I'm going to the store. I'm going to run and go get some smokes. And then went off to Jacksonville to re-engage in conversations with the second family. It's crazy. It was a wild situation. Now, he did tell head coach Todd Bowles, hey, I'm still interested in this Jacksonville Jaguars job, but I don't know how apparent he made it that he was secretly flying to Jacksonville to have these conversations while his phone just rang and rang and rang and rang. Don't worry, it'll go to voicemail kind of approach. So when we talk about the Uno reverse, that's what we mean. He was locked in with Jacksonville, goes away, ends up not taking the job. Jacksonville fires their general manager, Trent Baalke, and then all of a sudden they call Liam Coen back. They're like, hey, Baalke's gone. Would you be willing to reconsider? And Liam Cohen's like, yeah, I'll be there in a little bit. And then didn't tell anybody except for Todd Bowles that he was indeed going to do that. So he ends up taking the job in Jacksonville. Wild story. Wild situation as a whole when it comes to all of it. But for New Orleans, massively helpful because it allows them to effectively now run uncontested for a bunch of their top head coaching prospects. It takes the only team that was remaining with the young star potential quarterback off the board, and then matches the New Orleans Saints up with the Las Vegas Raiders, who are settling on their deal with Pete Carroll, and in the Dallas Cowboys, who are kind of just marching to the beat of their own drum. And so now all of a sudden the Saints have gone from being potentially what some people have called the least desirable job available to being the most desirable job available, because it might soon be the only job left available. Some people will call this being patient. I call this a little bit of luck, right? I mean, the New Orleans Saints were indeed patient because they had to be, right? They had to wait if they were going to interview Joe Brady until he's either no longer coaching or in the, in that bye week between the conference championship games and the Super Bowl. Same thing for Kellen Moore. Same thing for Kliff Kingsbury. They have their interview with Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver today. They speak with Mike Kafka, New York Giants offensive coordinator and assistant head coach tomorrow. And then Mike McCarthy, former Dallas Cowboys head coach, interviews at some time next week. And it's not like the Saints have any competition with the Dallas Cowboys for the guy that just parted ways with the Dallas Cowboys, right? So that puts them in a really, really good position here. And it all starts and all stems from this wild, wacky, weird situation that took place with Liam Coen doubling back and going back to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars had the potential to become a major player in competition for the New Orleans Saints for some of these young, innovative offensive minds. Now, they will not do that because they got their young, innovative offensive mind who was not on the list for the New Orleans Saints. He was one of my favorite guys, but he was never on the list for the New Orleans Saints, as it seems. And so with that being the case now, New Orleans is in a really, really good position. And again, has made themselves the most desirable by being the last opportunity standing. Not a bad situation, if you ask me, because you're going to be waiting anyway to interview these guys that are still in the NFC and AFC championship games. So in a way, this worked out in terms of the way that the chips fell around the New Orleans Saints approach. Either the Saints got really, really lucky, or let's just say it all went exactly to plan. We'll give a little bit of a benefit of the doubt there. But no, really, they got really lucky in this situation, right? And so, but no one's going to be mad about that because the Saints really have their pick of the litter here when it comes to their top candidates. Coming up next, the other best news for the New Orleans Saints is that no one with the remaining head coaching job open seems to be looking at the same candidates that the New Orleans Saints are. So the Saints have a clear runway to go and get their guy. Can they do it? Is the question. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's you versus the house versus the projections for your favorite players who are playing your favorite sports. It's you and your sports opinions and knowledge. It's an easy way to turn it into real cash with daily fantasy player projections. Here's how it works. Prize Picks gives you a projection on a player. You pick more or less than that projection. You get 2 to 6 of those right. Bang, you're walking away with up to 1,000 times your money. You got Taco Tuesday discounts, weekly promos, and even more value that add even more value to your lineups. And this week, there's a free pick. Jaden Daniels, the Washington Commanders quarterback in the NFC Championship game, only needs 1 passing yard for you to win 1 square. Bang, you're off to an easy win to get started. Then you can just add from there. So here's a special offer for all of our Locked On listeners. Download the PrizePicks app today and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup with promo code LOCKEDONNFL on PrizePicks. Run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints are the benefactors of a dramatic search, turnaround, Uno reverse over in Jacksonville, but they're also the benefactors of another dramatic hire, and that was the Las Vegas Raiders hiring Pete Carroll. Again, the runway is wide open for the New Orleans Saints now, thanks to the way that these other teams around them have hired, and the Saints interview list remains mostly unscathed, of course, with the exception of Aaron Glenn, who did take that New York Jets job, but we've expected that all along for New Orleans. So now they have the opportunity to just have a clear runway at some of their top candidates. Let's take a look at what happened with the Las Vegas Raiders coaching job, and which will be a quick conversation. And I'll introduce you to the candidates that the Dallas Cowboys have shown interest in, which has like absolutely no bearing on what it is that the New Orleans Saints are doing. Now, this can all change because names can always be added to these searches, but here's how things stand right now for the New Orleans Saints' remaining competition. The Jags are out, right? They hired their guy. We already knew that the Bears, the Patriots, that, you know, the other teams have all hired their guys. So the only ones that were remaining when it came down to, and the Jets, of course. So the only ones that were remaining outside of New Orleans were the Las Vegas Raiders and the Dallas Cowboys. But the Las Vegas Raiders, as of Friday morning, are set to hire Pete Carroll, the former Seattle Seahawks head coach. Of course, Carroll and the Seahawks split a couple years ago, maybe last year, I can't remember. But Mike McDonald took over there, the former Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator. And so Carroll's been out of the game for a little bit, but at 73 years old, soon to be 74, is now the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. This is not a Raiders podcast, so I'm just going to say this very quickly. I love that hire for the Raiders. I like it for the Raiders. If you want to know why, hit me up. I won't waste your time here because this is a Saints show. It's not a Raiders show. So that's done, right? And the Raiders were an interesting one because the Raiders really liked Liam Coen. The Raiders really liked Ben Johnson, right? And the Raiders really wanted Ben Johnson. That was their first pick from my conversations with people over in Vegas who have been covering this team. And that basically everyone was on board with Pete Carroll, including, of course, Tom Brady over there, pretty much since they missed out on Ben Johnson. But I was always really curious that because they liked Ben Johnson, because they liked Liam Coen, that maybe since they didn't get either one of those guys, that they too would go back to the young, innovative offensive coach pool, the Joe Bradys, the Kellen Moores, the Kliff Kingsburys. But they didn't. They instead went over to Pete Carroll, who's going to be a bit of a program builder for them and all those other things. So that's now set. So that means that the only head coaching jobs that now remain on the market are the New Orleans Saints and the Dallas Cowboys. The New Orleans Saints candidates include Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver. I won't go through all this, but Anthony Weaver, Mike Kafka, Darren Rizzi, Mike McCarthy, Kellen Moore, Kliff Kingsbury, maybe, and then of course Joe Brady. So those are the guys that still remain on the New Orleans Saints interview list. The only one that also did an interview with them that has taken a job, as we mentioned earlier, was Aaron Glenn. Now listen to the names that are on the Dallas Cowboys interview list. Dallas Cowboys have Leslie Frazier, former Seattle Seahawks assistant head coach. They did an interview with him. Kellen Moore, the Eagles offensive coordinator. So there's a little bit of overlap there. That one we already knew, though, because Kellen Moore was the former offensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. It's where he really jumped out on the map. Robert Saleh, former Jets head coach, and then Brian Schottenheimer, the Cowboys' former offensive coordinator, who not only did an interview, but actually did a second interview. All signs so far have pointed to Brian Schottenheimer being the guy for Dallas, which is really interesting because they parted ways with Mike McCarthy and now they're focused on continuity all of a sudden. Does it feel like continuity would have been just riding with Mike McCarthy? But anyway, that's where the Dallas Cowboys search is going. So with the exception of Kellen Moore, there's no overlap for the New Orleans Saints when it comes to this position. And as you know, for me, Kellen Moore has been a little low on the list. He's high on some people's lists. For me, Ross, he's a little bit lower. That's just my opinion, though. Doesn't mean that he's low on the Saints list. So that could be a little problematic for New Orleans. But if they hire Brian Schottenheimer, which is something that some folks have said could happen as soon as today, then all of a sudden, the Saints are the lone job remaining. And out of their initial 8 candidates, 7 of them, potentially 6, depending upon what happens with Kingsbury, 7 of them are just there. And again, the Saints have gone from being the place that a lot of people considered the least desirable head coach landing spot to being the only and therefore most desirable head coach landing spot, with effectively 7 of their 8 candidates still on the board. That's a pretty good situation. And I'll tell you, this ain't strategy. This ain't a, oh, no, we're good, let's not rush kind of a thing. This just happened to work out this way for New Orleans. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing, because if Mike McCarthy's at the top of the list for New Orleans, they already have a clear runway. Because it's not like the Dallas Cowboys are going to call up Mike McCarthy and say, Mike, please come back. It's not like that's going to happen and everything. So they're completely uncontested when it comes to Mike McCarthy. Now, an interview request could pop up for a Joe Brady. An interview request for Kellen Moore, a second interview request for Kellen Moore could happen in Dallas, and that could end up putting the Saints in a situation where they lose out on one of those other offensive guys. But until that happens, they're kind of in the clear here. So if we revisit our tiers from not too long ago, right? Not necessarily looking at who is the top option, even though my favorite option is Joe Brady. Looking at the tiers, the Saints are in a good spot here. Mike McCarthy, I assume Darren Rizzi's probably a top tier guy for them. Joe Brady should be a top tier guy for them. Looking at the second tier, I think you're looking at guys like Anthony Weaver, who just might be another year or two away. I'm still pro Weaver. I think Weaver's good. He's right on that kind of cusp between tier 1 and tier 2 for me. But I could see a team putting him at tier 2 because of the experience factor and all those other things. And, defensive coach and all this other stuff. Do I think that defensive coaches should be avoided? No, I think if you're a good coach, you're a good coach. But I don't know how the NFL looks at it because it varies from team to team. Then you look at guys like Mike Kafka, Kellen Moore, and then you got to see what happens with Kliff Kingsbury. I said this in yesterday's episode. I don't think that you look at Kliff Kingsbury as no longer being an option because he said, hey, I don't want to do any head coach interviews until my team, the Washington Commanders, are no longer in playoff competition. I don't think that that's a thing that makes you go, oh, well, forget that guy. You know what I mean? I don't think that probably changes or reflects negatively to NFL teams on Kliff Kingsbury because he made that decision. But outside of Kellen Moore, the Saints at this point are in the complete clear to go out there and land their guys. So they can do their interviews. They can wait until Joe Brady, Kellen Moore, potentially Kliff Kingsbury become available next week for a second interview. And then effectively pick the guy that separates themselves in the interviews. And when I say second interview, I mean following up from the virtual interviews. Kingsbury wouldn't be following up on a virtual interview. That would be his first interview. But I think the decision to not take a virtual interview because he wanted to be with his team is a pretty good interview, if you ask me. But it's a great situation for New Orleans. This worked out extremely well for them. It's not over, right? The Dallas Cowboys could still do something that throws a wrench in all this, but they've kind of been marching to the beat of their own drum, Jerry's drum. And so far, that works out really, really well for New Orleans. So with all that being the case, the timeline for the New Orleans Saints is pretty clear because they could have a head coach hired as soon as next week. Let's break all that down as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time, the absolute best place to go and get your tickets for your favorite events. Right now, the New Orleans Pelicans' next home game is on the 29th, going up against the Dallas Mavericks. $1 tickets up in the upper bowl, $32 tickets down in the club section. Man, it just doesn't get any better than Game Time. I absolutely love Game Time. I use it all the time. One of my favorite memories from the summer was John Hendricks and I from over at Second and Saints. We bought tickets to go to an Angels game. We spent like maybe $20 to go to an Angels game. And it was an incredible game while we were out there in Irvine covering Saints training camp. Grand slam in my first ever live MLB game. I mean, how cool was that? So absolutely loved it. Highly recommend Game Time. Whether you're looking for tickets for your favorite events, sports, comedy, theater, whatever it is that you're looking for. Take all the guesswork out of buying tickets over with Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints could be announcing their next head coach hire as soon as this coming week, right? Here we are on a Friday. the New Orleans Saints have an interview today, an interview tomorrow, Friday and Saturday, and then they move on to some interviews next week. The good news for New Orleans is that now is the time that you can start using the word patient. I wouldn't call what happened before them just being patient, right? A lot of things worked out in their favor in this situation, but the being patient part, I think, makes sense for New Orleans here. So when it comes to timeline, they could hire somebody as soon as basically the Anthony Weaver and Mike Kafka interviews are done. That would satisfy the Rooney Rule. That means that there would be nothing that would stop them from hiring either one of those guys or any of the other competition. They will have done what they needed to do to satisfy that rule and then move ahead in terms of their hiring process. Again, I'm not going to go into my comments on the Rooney Rule, but just it does have an impact on the timeline, right? So that's all that I'm saying about that. The way that the Saints now move forward is entirely up to them. If the Dallas Cowboys do indeed hire Brian Schottenheimer, which seems likely and seems like the way that things are go, we've seen, Clarence Hall, all these other people kind of say hey, this deal could get done as soon as Friday. So we'll see if that ends up happening today. Then the Saints have no reason to rush. They could do every single one of those interviews. And then really the only competition that they have is the opportunity that those coordinators would have to go back to, right? The Saints are no longer competing with the Dallas Cowboys and the New England Patriots and the Jacksonville Jaguars and Las Vegas Raiders and so on and so forth. Instead, they're competing with the Miami Dolphins for Anthony Weaver, right? Because he could go back to his situation. They're competing with the Buffalo Bills for Joe, I almost said Joe Marino, who's our host of Locked On Bills. I've been waiting. I knew I was going to do that eventually. Shout out to Joe Marino over at Locked On Bills. Competing with the Buffalo Bills for Joe Brady, right? So now the thing is that you're offering, right? You have the leverage because you're offering the head coach position, right? For Mike McCarthy, there is just no competition at all, right? Because the only team that remains with an open head coaching position is the Dallas Cowboys. Like we mentioned before, the Dallas Cowboys aren't going to call them up and say, hey, please reconsider. They could, I guess, but it just doesn't, that's not going to happen. And so, or it'd be very unlikely for that to happen. Liam Coen, we thought, was very unlikely to happen for Jacksonville after he walked away, and then we saw what happened there. So for New Orleans, their timeline is really up to them at this point. But here's the thing, they could go and interview, they could get Joe Brady in, fly him in on Monday after the game on Sunday, interview him on Tuesday, and make a decision right there if he knocks their socks off, right? But then if they have Kellen Moore scheduled for Wednesday, they could also wait until Wednesday, do the interview with Kellen Moore. If Mike McCarthy's then scheduled on Thursday, they could wait until then. If Kliff Kingsbury is scheduled on Friday, they could wait until the end of the week to basically say, okay, we've interviewed everybody that we had left on the list, now ready to make the decision. It wouldn't harm them in any way. They could do that because there's no competition. The only competition would be the team that those people are already with, but you hold the leverage as the team that's offering the head coach position. Now, if you start seeing offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators say, yeah, you know what? I'm going to stay where I'm at. That gives you a little bit of a glimpse into how enticing the New Orleans Saints job offer, pitch, sell, whatever. I know they feel like they don't have to sell, they don't have to pitch, but it's part of the gig. You have to sell, you do have to pitch. You know what I mean? It's part of what you're doing here, right? Not only do you have to be interested in the candidate, but the candidate's got to be interested in you as well, right? So you got to offer certain things. You got to be willing to offer patience. You got to be willing to offer a vision. You got to be willing to match their vision, all those other things. And so for New Orleans, if you start seeing those coordinators go back to their coordinator jobs, then it tells you a lot, right? That would be loud. That would be a loud situation, no doubt. But it doesn't mean that the Saints have to rush because who are they competing with, right? Saints don't have to say, I said in the other episode, a couple episodes ago, that the Saints need to steal the approach from the New York Jets and make sure that they're the first stop for their competition. Now, they don't have to do that. They don't have to box out anymore, like we talked about when I used my terrible basketball reference in another episode. They don't have to box out anymore, right? They got a free run to the basket here. They just have to convince that prospect, that candidate, that coach, that coordinator, that they are right for them. And so that's where the next piece falls into place, or has to fall into place, when it comes down to when it comes down to who the New Orleans Saints end up hiring. It's not just, are the Saints interested? They have to make themselves presentable. You look at the New Orleans Saints. There was something that just came out about the. This is from. I want to make sure that I credit where this is coming from, but it's about NFL teams with the viewers and viewership and stuff like that. So it had the top 10 teams in best viewer average. This is from Sportico, and then bottom 10 teams in viewer average. And the New Orleans Saints were the second lowest team, or excuse me, the ninth lowest team. I read the thing the wrong way. At just 15.21 million viewers. The Saints have to do something that inspires its fan base. It has to do something that inspires viewership. It has to do something that puts itself back. It's got to hire somebody here who puts themselves back in primetime viewing and all those other things, which is a big reason why the Saints number is so low when it comes to that. And just for reference, the top was about another 7 million viewers in addition, another 7.4 million viewers in addition for the Detroit Lions, who averaged about 22.65 million. So for New Orleans, this is an important hire. This is an important hire for them. This is an important hire for their fan base, for you. This is an important hire for Mickey Loomis, who has to prove that he can still get this done. There's no one else to point the finger at if this head coach hire doesn't work. The only place to point the finger goes to Mickey Loomis. There's nowhere else to go. So for the Saints, they have to be really invested in this. And one of the best ways to get their best result here is to hire somebody they can be patient with. And I think the young offensive-minded head coaches are the ones that check that box. While Mike McCarthy might not be the most inspiring out there, it might be the guy that's most interesting to New Orleans as a safe hire, but maybe safety's not the way to go. So we'll see which way New Orleans goes. But on this timeline, the Saints could hire a head coach as early as next week. The caveat being, let's say that they hire Kellen Moore, right? And the Philadelphia Eagles beat the Washington Commanders to advance to the Super Bowl. You'll hear a report. This is kind of what happened with Clint Kubiak last year. You would hear a report that says that the Saints are expected to hire Kellen Moore as their next head coach sometime next week. You could hear that report, but they couldn't finalize the deal. You couldn't put the ink on the paper until after the Super Bowl. So that's the one little caveat or hiccup here, but you probably still hear reports that they are agreeing in principle on a deal or whatever ahead of time, that the Saints are expected to hire Kellen Moore. It's exactly what happened with Clint Kubiak last year. Clint Kubiak was coaching in the Super Bowl. The Saints, during that Senior Bowl week, the news broke, and we knew all along, but the news broke that they were expected to hire Clint Kubiak as their next offensive coordinator, but then the deal couldn't be signed until after the Super Bowl. So that's the one little timeline thing. But other than that, the Saints will have cleared every hurdle that they need to make a hire as early as next week. And it being at the Senior Bowl, being in Mobile, all those other things provides you a big opportunity to knock out some more of those in-person interviews. Or you bring them here to New Orleans and you send a different team of people to the Senior Bowl. You can absolutely do that. But this is an important hire for New Orleans, and it could be on the way as soon as this coming week. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here with us, to making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL. In tomorrow's episode, I'm finally going to get to those free agents and some of those late round draft picks that you should be paying attention to. Remember, we're 7 days a week here on Locked On Saints. We'll have a new episode for you tomorrow on Saturday, as well as on Sunday. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.